The swift and sudden fall of Bashar al-Assad marks a pivotal moment in the Middle East. The sudden turn of events has left regional powers and the world scrambling. Iran no longer holding a grip on what was once a satellite state. Its axis of resistance is crumbling before us. But with Donald Trump's return to the White House nearing, what is his plan with the ever-changing and shifting dynamics in the Middle East? Joining us to make sense of all of this is Elliott Abrams, the former U.S. Special Representative for Iran during the first Trump administration. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Elliott Abrams, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
If we take a step back and look at the Middle East in the past 6 months, it's really been quite astonishing. I mean, in May, we had the helicopter crash that killed Iran's president, Ebrahim Raisi. Then we've got the open and direct attacks between Iran and Israel, which was quite unprecedented. On top of that, we've got the assassination of Hamas leaders Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran on Iranian soil, and then, of course, Yahya Sinwar in the Gaza Strip, the pager attacks that took out most of the top leadership of Hezbollah, the targeted killing of a man once thought to be untouchable, Hassan Nasrallah, and now you've got Bashar al-Assad out of the game here. So, I mean, it's even exhausting. Just saying it is exhausting, right? President-elect Donald Trump is really coming in at a time to his second presidency that's like no other. As his former Iran envoy, as someone who knows him, as someone who worked with him, what was your experience like with President-elect Trump when it came to Iran and the Middle East and foreign policy in general? What was his approach like?
I think people all remember the Maximum Pressure campaign. What they don't always remember is what was Trump's goal in that campaign. It was not, for better or worse, it was not the overthrow of the regime. It was a comprehensive negotiation. His criticism of the Obama deal was that it was time-bound and it was not comprehensive. It didn't deal with Iran's missile program, and it didn't deal with Iran's support for terrorism, all the proxies in the region. Trump wanted a deal that would handle all of those. And I believe he still does want such a deal. I think the danger, to get right to it, is that Iran will kind of trap him in negotiations that will go on and on and on and on and on while they are trying to advance with their nuclear program. But Trump is not someone who wanted a kind of violent confrontation with Iran. What he wanted was a serious, real, comprehensive, negotiated deal, which may or may not be available.
And how did that make you feel as a former Iran envoy when you were in that position, given, if you could tell us a little bit about your views and how you see Iran in foreign policy?
I thought that approach was, of course, a lot better than the Obama approach. And I had never been a supporter of the JCPOA. But I thought that it had two main difficulties. The first was, again, that Iran could just keep the negotiations going on and on and on and on, and meanwhile, secretly, would be progressing with their nuclear program. The second problem was that even if you had that deal, and it was a good deal on its terms, you're abandoning the people of Iran to that regime. You are saying, well, as long as they don't support Hezbollah, as long as they don't do this and that, then we'll do nothing to help the people of Iran get rid of that regime. One of the reasons that, there's an answer to that concern, and the answer is, well, if they ever agreed to stop the missile program completely, if they ever agreed to stop the nuclear weapons program, if they ever agreed to stop supporting Shia militias in Iraq and the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon, etc., it wouldn't really be the same regime, which is why, by the way, I think they'll never agree to all that. But those were my key concerns.
Now, you talked about the dangers and ongoing negotiations and your concerns. I remember during the election campaign, a lot of Iran analysts inside Iran were talking about how the Iranians are really taking into consideration a potential Trump second presidency, which obviously is true now, and that Pezeshkian is somebody that they wanted to almost be like a so-called charm offensive on Trump. Do you think then, based on what you're saying, that Trump could actually be fooled?
It's not completely inconceivable. Both the new national security advisor, or the next one, Mike Waltz, and Senator Rubio at State have pretty robust records of understanding Iran and understanding the evil of the regime. And so they are kind of obstacles to that happening, which is a very good thing. But I noticed, for example, that Iran is already talking about, if you will, kissing and making up with the IAEA about allowing more inspections. What's that about? Why does that happen now? I think it happens because of Donald Trump. That is, they want to pull Trump into a negotiation. One of the issues is the IAEA inspections. So they're going to start negotiating with the IAEA about allowing more access to Iran. So I think, this is their game. And I'm just hoping that people like Waltz and Rubio will say to the president, when he becomes president again, this is the Iranian game. Don't fall for it.
Would Trump care?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, he doesn't want to look like some kind of sucker or fool who was fooled by Iran. But in my view, the danger is there. An example, go back 8 years when he became president in 2017. He went to the UN for the first time. It's the UN General Assembly meeting in September 2017. He was willing to meet Khatami. The reason that meeting didn't take place was the supreme leader said no. It would have taken place. So I think one should be worried about this. I hope it doesn't happen. My hope, of course, is that he returns to the maximum pressure campaign immediately and says to the government of Iran, of course that campaign can come to an end when you perform. Performing does not mean that you're willing to sit down either directly or indirectly with American negotiators, whether you sit in the same room or you do it through the Egyptians or the Qataris. No, it means that on your nuclear program, on your support for terrorism, something changes. And American sanctions in full stay on until those changes actually happen.
In terms of your role as a former Iran envoy under Trump, what was it like dealing with him? Does he take well to advice, for example?
It varies. I mean, he does take advice. There's no question about that. And I think, he's had 4 years of experience as president, which is a great thing. And he's hired some people who I think are in the foreign policy area who are people well worth listening to. My worry is that there are going to be cross-cutting paths of advice, by which I mean he will hear, I think, some what I would view as good, tough advice from Rubio and Waltz. But then there are other people who may be giving different advice. And this doesn't have to be at National Security Council meetings, in formal settings. It can be at a lunch. It can be at a phone call. It can be at a golf club. So I think he'll be getting bad advice and he'll be getting good advice. That really happens to every president. But I think the worry here is that the regime in Tehran knows this, and they're very clever, and they will try to play off of this. If you lowered the sanctions, there'd be more oil production, which there would not be, by the way. But world oil prices will come down. So I think these are the concerns that one has to go into this with one's eyes open.
I'm glad you brought that up. Let's dig deeper into it because a few weeks ago I spoke to Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, and he was assisting Jared Kushner on the Abraham Accords, and he's known Donald Trump on a personal level for more than 20 years now, he said. And he believes that Trump rules through this whole divide and conquer method. And you can kind of see that in some way with some of his cabinet picks. Like you mentioned, you've got the so-called Iran hawks like Senator Marco Rubio, and then you've got Mike Waltz. But then you've also got people like Tulsi Gabbard, who have in the past at least been openly supportive of Assad and Vladimir Putin. So those are very diverging foreign policy interests there, like you mentioned. What does that suggest to you about Donald Trump?
Well, mostly it suggests that he wants to be the guy making the decisions. He's not afraid to have, differing opinions. He likes it. I mean, President Franklin Roosevelt was a little bit like this. That is, he wanted a team of people. He wanted to decide everything, and he wanted them to argue. And he wanted to be the person who decides. It's, in principle, it's not a bad thing. I would worry a little bit frankly, about Tulsi Gabbard in one way. That's not the job of the intelligence people to argue policy. Their job is to say, this is the best intelligence we have. Now you decide the policy. So I hope she doesn't do that. It's inappropriate for the head of the CIA or for the director of national intelligence to be making policy recommendations. But yeah, I mean, Trump is going to get a lot of different policy views coming into the Oval Office.
And speaking to that, you've got, add Elon Musk into the mix, and he met with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations recently in New York. Of course, we have no clue what they talked about. We don't even know if that was sanctioned by President-elect Donald Trump or if he even knew about it. What do you make of this?
Well, first I make the assumption that Trump knew about it. It's a big deal, and I don't think Musk would have done it and kind of sprung it on the president and said, hey, guess what I did yesterday? So I assume that he knew about it. I think it was a terrible idea for many reasons. First of all, it's a kind of signal of wanting to negotiate, which I think it was wrong to send now, and to send through Musk. I mean, with all due respect, I take him to be a business genius. But that doesn't mean he knows a lot about diplomacy. For example, that's an important meeting. What is the record of that meeting that we, the Americans, have? We don't have any record of the meeting. I mean, Musk is not trained at this. He's not trained at remembering the details. Did he have a note taker with him? With any, real diplomat, you would have had a note taker writing it all down. I assume the Iranians recorded the meeting. So they've got it, probably, word for word. We don't seem to have it word for word. That's why I think it was a bad idea. We have no idea what Musk said. We have no idea whether it really was what the president wanted him to say. Did they have I think the answer to this question is no, but did they have an hour-long discussion in advance and bring in some Iran experts to talk about what Iran might say or might ask for and what's the appropriate response? Again, Musk is unquestionably a brilliant person, but that doesn't mean he knows what he's doing in a diplomatic meeting.
That's a really good point. And you said it was a bad signal, especially during this time. Is this a sign of more of this to come with the Trump presidency 2.0?
Well, it may be a sign of, diplomats, people in the State Department always like what senators call regular order. This is the way you do things. You do them this way, not that way. Man, that is not Donald Trump. I mean, so I think, will we have more of this? Yes, we'll have more of it. I mean, some of it has worked out brilliantly. It was not regular order for his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to come in and work on the Abraham Accords. He was incredibly successful at it. And if you go back to the beginning, people mocked him, Kushner. People said, this is ridiculous, this son-in-law. But he was brilliant at it. we were lucky there. Not everybody who does that is brilliant at it, but I do think you're going to see that kind of thing where it happens to some degree in every administration, happens more with Trump, where, the Secretary of State negotiates, but so do, old friends and old business associates and relatives. I mean, that's Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that because Jeffrey Sonnenfeld also said the same thing about Kushner, that he was absolutely brilliant, created really great relations with those moderate Arab states, and still has a lot of clout and gravitas in the region.
Yes.
And when it comes to kind of the chatter on social media, we've been hearing from a lot of people who are against the Iranian establishment and also people who are security analysts, Middle East experts, who are saying that after Assad's fall, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is next. What do you make of that? I mean, I've been hearing a lot about how we could potentially be going back to the negotiating table through Trump and Iran. Do you really feel that Assad's fall and everything else we've been seeing in the Middle East, which has been, as we talked about at the beginning, completely unprecedented, lead to the fall of Khamenei?
It's funny, if we were having this conversation a year ago, or I don't know, 6 months ago, but certainly a year ago, we'd have thought Iran is riding high. Their system of terrorist proxies in the region is a brilliant system and it's working. But now it's collapsed. I think it's wrong for Trump to go back exactly to what he was thinking 4 years ago, because in those 4 years, a lot has changed. I mean, Iran made many advances, but now in the last year in particular, a lot of it has collapsed. Iran looks more isolated and weaker today, certainly than it has at any time under Biden. And I think we need to begin the analysis of Iran by saying, well, look what's happened. Look at its position throughout the region. If you think about Israeli attacks on Iran, which has happened already because Iran attacked Israel directly, they're clearing the route to fly. I mean, what is the route? Over Lebanon and Syria, there's no air defenses now, something they used to have to worry about. They've destroyed the air defenses that Assad had built up. And they've destroyed the SA-3 system in Iran itself, or a lot of it. So I think you got to start with where you are today. And Khamenei, by the way, if you look at when Trump came to office 8 years ago, he's 8 years older. And at this point, people in Iran and everywhere are talking about how long does he have left? Certainly for Khamenei, I mean, who's more aware of his health situation than you or I, this must be a terrible, terrible turn of events. To have lost Assad, your only real important Arab ally, to have lost Hezbollah as a fighting force after, who knows, $40 billion of investment over decades, to have lost the Arab figure closest to you, Nasrallah. I mean, these are huge setbacks. Now, you asked if what happened in Syria can happen in Iran. In Spanish, there's a word, ojalá, which comes from the Moorish time, meaning, if only Allah would do that.
Yes, you're right. Yeah.
And it's now a word in Spanish, and I can only say to you, ojalá. That is, I certainly hope for that day. I think we cannot predict it. That is, who a month or two ago was predicting the fall of Assad? Who predicted the fall of the Soviet regime?
Not even 2 days before the fall of Assad were people predicting the fall of Assad, right? Even Syrians.
Right. The fall of Mubarak. I mean, all these things were not predicted. What we did see was that the Assad regime was much more brittle than people outside thought. We knew that a lot of Syrians hated that regime because of what it had done to them and to the country. We know of the tens of millions of Iranians who hate this regime, a regime for which they never voted, a regime which has been brutally repressive. and which they have risen up to get rid of time after time after time. Will it happen in a year, or will it take 10 years? I mean, I think we have no way of knowing. But I do think that what happened in Syria should remind us in the West, in Europe and in the U.S., that these regimes are like the Soviet regime. No matter how strong they appear, no matter how large their army, they're fundamentally brittle because inside, everyone knows that the people of the country want the regime to fall. And you never know once that starts whether it then stops or goes the whole way.
What choices? Does Iran have any choices right now?
Yes. I mean, first of all, there's the good choice that they're not going to take, which is to say, you remember the great question of Henry Kissinger, when will they decide to be a nation rather than a cause? They have that choice, which they're not going to take because they haven't taken it for these decades. They have the choice to just try to rebuild it all. That is to say,
can they?
Hezbollah is still there. It would take a very long time and a very large investment. They don't have the money right now. And to build up Hezbollah from where it is now, it would take them a decade or two. My fear is that looking at this, they will say we have only one choice: nuclear weapons. And from the point of view of the Ayatollah Khamenei, it's not a crazy choice. It's an evil and dangerous choice. But it's not crazy for him to say, okay, everything we've been trying to do conventionally with these proxies has been blown up. It's gone. And we can't really rebuild it in any thinkable timescale. So how do we protect ourselves? Nuclear weapons. Of course, it's a foolish choice if he makes it for a number of reasons. One of them is look at the Soviet Union. They had nuclear weapons, and it didn't save them from falling from within. But he may push in that direction. And this new thing where they're going to allow, where they say they will allow more inspections by the IAEA. The IAEA does not get to inspect military sites and other sites that the Iranian regime calls a private site. I mean, it doesn't look serious. I think one of the things that the United States and Israel need to talk about now with the coming of the Trump administration is what to do about the Iranian nuclear program. I mean, President Trump said last time what President Bush had said, what President Biden has said, which is we are not going to permit Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And obviously the Israelis have said that too. Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon. We don't know exactly how close, or at least I don't, because while they are much closer when it comes to enriched uranium, I don't know how close they are to having a warhead. People say 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, but you don't need a gigantic factory to produce a warhead. You can do that in secret in small laboratories. Are we sure we know? So I think we're getting at the point where that question has to be revisited. And it's certainly going to be revisited now by the Israelis.
So when Trump and Netanyahu say, like you just mentioned, that we won't allow Iran to become a nuclear power, what does that entail? More maximum pressure? Like, how far can you go with that?
I think what you're really saying to the regime is you can spend all the money you want and do all the work, but in the end, we're not going to let you get there. I think Trump should reiterate that. We're not going to let you get there. And if it requires the use of military force, then we will use military force. Because what you want the regime to know is it should stop. It's wasting billions of dollars on these programs, and they will never be brought to fruition. To make that credible, first of all, I think Trump is much more credible than Biden. and particularly after the killing of Soleimani. But there are other things you can do. You can do more drills, even drills with the Israelis. You can make sure the Israelis have, for example, tankers to refuel aircraft that need the range to get to Iran. These are all symbols that he means it when he says, we're not going to permit you to get a nuclear weapon. And I think that's the first thing, if there are any discussions with Iran, that's the first thing that should be repeated to them.
And would Trump be willing to make any concessions in the process with Iran and vice versa?
Well, in theory, if they do the things we want them to do, the sanctions start being lifted. I think it's very important not to lift the sanctions as a reward for sitting down at the table. That's not a concession. A concession is in the real world. In the end, I mean, that's what they want, and that's what they started getting, particularly from Obama. And in a sense, they've gotten it from Biden, too, because to fail to enforce sanctions is a concession on the part of the United States. So what I think we have to, in principle, what we're offering is beginning to lift sanctions. What you need from Iran is not agreeing to talk. What you need is actual behavioral changes.
And you also worked with George W. Bush. How did your experience with Bush on the Middle East and Iran in general differ, or was it similar in any way to your experience with Trump?
It was, of course, we were at that point, we had the Afghan and Iraq wars after 2002, 2003 for the rest of the administration. The president made that statement about not permitting Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I'm sometimes asked, why didn't he do anything about it? I think the answer is partly, now we're going back, 15, 20 years, they were not close to having a nuclear weapon. Today, they're much, much closer. I think Bush also felt, life is unpredictable, but he felt his successor would likely be John McCain. And if it were necessary to strike the Iranian nuclear program militarily, he had confidence that McCain would do it. But this is far back, and they really weren't, even in terms of enriched uranium. They weren't where they are now. Where they are now, they basically passed that threshold. As Secretary of State Blinken has said, they're weeks away from having the enriched uranium they need. And they've enriched up to 60%. And no country has ever done that, by the way, and not built a nuclear weapon.
That's a good point.
So they're moving in that direction. It's conceivable that they would now make a big dash to get a warhead. My hope is, of course, that we would know that. We would have sufficient, we or the Israelis or the British, others would have sufficient intelligence, and we'd have time to act.
Going back to Assad, Trump tweeted that the U.S. shouldn't get involved in Syria. It's not our fight. Is the fall of Assad, a good thing, a bad thing, or just completely indifferent for President-elect Donald Trump?
When he said it's not our fight, I think what he's thinking of is something that President Trump always thought about, is what he calls endless wars, where the United States is involved with troops on the ground and American troops dying year after year after year after year after year, and Afghanistan being the best or worst example of that. He does not want to engage in another Middle Eastern war. And I bet you Trump would say to somebody who says, yes, but, Syria may break up, I bet that Trump would say, it's an artificial country anyway. Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1918, the British and the French decided where the borders would be, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Is Trump willing to fight to keep Syria one united country? No. No, he may prefer it, but he's certainly not going to fight for that to happen. I think he appreciates, anybody in the U.S. government would how important Syria has been for Iran and for Hezbollah as the route that armaments took going from Iran to Hezbollah. And to say that it's not our fight is not to say that we're indifferent. We know that it matters to Turkey and to Jordan and to Israel and to Iraq. But I think what he's making clear is that, we have friends and allies who are going to play a role, and we have friends and allies who will be affected by what happens in Syria. And American diplomacy will no doubt play a role, but he's not sending Americans to fight for unity in Syria.
Do you think that we're going to see...
Just one other point on that.
Yeah, of course.
I think critical thing to see in the first maybe 6 months, there are roughly 900 American troops there working to defeat ISIS. President Biden wanted to take them out, never got around to it. President Trump wanted to take them out and was persuaded not to, mostly by the Pentagon and National Security Advisor John Bolton. And in principle, Trump would go in as president saying, okay, let's get those guys home. I hope he holds off on that because the situation in Syria now is very uncertain. You have Turks in the north. You have the SDF that the U.S. is supporting, the SFA that the Turks are supporting. You've got Druze forces. You've got Kurdish forces. You've got the remnants of the Syrian army. You've got the Israelis in the Golan. If the American troops come out right now, I would worry very much about a kind of starting of rebuilding of ISIS. My argument to President Trump would be, if they do rebuild and there is a terrorist attack and Americans die, people are going to blame you. They're going to go back and say, it was Trump's decision to pull the American troops out. So I would hope that he would at least be willing to defer until we get a much better picture of what's going to happen in Syria. What will the government of Syria be?
Yeah, what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see another Islamic Republic, another Afghanistan 2.0?
Well, it's not inconceivable. I think the difference is the Taliban has been better at taking over the whole government of Afghanistan. I don't know that Golani is going to be able to do that because, after all, he goes into a situation where Assad did not have control over the whole country. I mean, he had Damascus, he had Aleppo, but there were large parts of the country that were not under Assad's control. I don't know that Golani is going to be able to assert control over those, certainly not at the beginning. And I would argue certainly not if he takes a kind of Islamist attitude in which the role of, for example, the Kurds or of the Druze or of Christians is threatened immediately, and if he tries to reestablish himself as a kind of radical Islamist leader. So far, he's sending messages that say, no. I want to go after the murderers from the Assad regime. Everybody else, the whole army, you're safe. In Aleppo, he tried to send messages, for example, to Christians saying, don't worry, you're safe. Who is he, really? What lessons has he learned? I think the only lesson we can be really pretty confident he learned is don't go after the Israelis, or you're going to end up like Sinwar or Nasrallah, dead. I think he's probably too smart to try to go after the Golan. But what is his view of how Syria should be governed? We're going to find out in the next 6 months.
Time will tell, but it's interesting that you mention Israel because I think he recently sent a message to Netanyahu saying that he doesn't want a war with Israel.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the situation in which Lebanon finds itself, Syria finds itself, it would be crazy for him to seek any kind of conflict with Israel. The Israelis, of course, don't trust him. and why should they, given his background? So what they've been doing in the days after the fall of Assad is to make sure he cannot do it by essentially eliminating the Syrian Air Force and Navy, and also in a step that we should all be grateful for, trying to eliminate the chemical and biological weapons stores by blowing them up, by incinerating them. We all know that Assad he had theoretically gotten rid of them, but he hadn't really. So we can all hope those are gone now.
And Jolani also appears to be very anti-Islamic Republic. What do you make of that?
He seems to be, whether it's a radical or non-radical, he is a Sunni, and he seems not to have any particular positive feeling about either Iran or the Shia groups that it's been supporting, which, by the way, bodes poorly for Hezbollah, of course, and the possibility that he would be willing to allow Syria to be used again as a highway for Iran to supply Hezbollah.
Given that, what do you think Iran is thinking right now? Like, is there internal strife amongst their leadership? Like, what must be going through their minds right now?
Boy, it seems to me that people in the IRGC and the Supreme Leader himself must be thinking, how did this happen to us? How did everything collapse in a matter of months? I mean, Hamas did not collapse quickly. It's been a war of attrition, really, that continues to this day. But Hezbollah and Assad, incredibly quick collapses. So one would hope that they are rethinking whether that strategy of building a kind of, well, what the King of Jordan once called the Shia Crescent, one would hope they're rethinking that and realizing it failed and it cannot be rebuilt. One would hope and pray that they're thinking about Kissinger's old question of thinking about Iran, thinking about their own country, and about building it rather than the Shia Crescent. There's no evidence for that. It's got to be true that some people inside, who knows, maybe even Pezeshkian, are wondering whether now is a point where they can turn to their own people and their own economy. We haven't seen any evidence of that. And in fact, in the last, really under Pezeshkian, we've seen a tightening of the rules, for example, on women's dress. So there's no evidence. There's no evidence yet to feel positive about the Iranian reaction.
And finally, I'm just curious, are you going to be having a role in the next Trump administration?
Well, the last time, I didn't go in at the beginning. I went in at the halfway mark. And I'm pretty happy with my life right now. So I'm not trying to go in, but, you never know. Fate.
Ojalá, as you said, right? So it all goes back to that. Thank you so much. That was a really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for all of your personal insight into Trump and the administration and all of the remarkable events that have unfolded in the past 6 months and weeks.
Well, I'm happy to do it. Very nice to talk with you.
Likewise. If you like this episode, please give the podcast a review or leave a comment. The Eye for Iran podcast series is created by Iran International, the go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.